Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Tax in 10 with me, Rachel D'Souza, and Andrew Robins. We are both tax partners in RSM's London office and have a wealth of experience in dealing with a wide variety of private client matters. Your feedback is valuable to us, so do keep it coming, especially if you have any thoughts of topics you would like us to cover. You can contact us by email, and our email addresses are at the bottom of your screen.
So, Rachel, I bet you £1 million you can't guess what I want to talk about today.
Well, firstly, you haven't got £1 million. And secondly, I know exactly what you want to talk about because we discussed it before we even started recording.
You are just no fun. Anyway, I want to talk about all sorts of gambling. I want to talk about poker because we actually look after the tax affairs of a number of professional poker players. And it's always struck me how difficult it can be on occasion to draw the line between what's taxable, what isn't. But I also want to talk about gambling with HMRC as well.
So the starting point, if we're talking about gambling, is that it's exempt from tax. And this makes a lot of sense from the government's perspective, especially when you consider that most gamblers actually lose money. So if gambling winnings were taxable and losses were allowable, it could end up costing the Treasury, quite a lot of money whenever that favourite, falls at the last fence. But of course, not all gambling is exempt, though, and bookmakers are, of course, taxable on their profits in the same way as any other business.
So thinking about our poker players, from a common sense point of view, it's easy to see the difference between me playing poker online for an hour or having an evening with friends playing for pennies, and on the other hand, a professional who's making large amounts of money playing international televised tournaments or something. It seems pretty obvious that if I get lucky and win a few pounds, then that's gambling. But that if my professional wins £1 million by beating everyone in an international tournament, that's just like being an international sports person, really. And so you'd expect that to be taxed as income. Where it gets tricky, though, is drawing the line between the two. At what point do I stop being a gambler and become a professional? Is it a question of how often I play, how successful I am, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, you're right. And day traders present a similar problem, don't they? So HMRC are very keen to argue that day trading is not a trading activity for tax, because although profits made by day traders are then only subject to CGT, losses can't be set against other income. And again, history shows us that over the medium term, most day traders actually struggle to make a profit. On the other hand, of course, the courts have made it clear that it is possible for an individual to trade in stocks and shares as a business if they are sufficiently disciplined about it. So I guess, like with your poker player, it really comes down to individual circumstances.
And this all presents a problem for us as advisors and for our clients. And it's not just an issue for gamblers. So in the good old days, we regularly used to test HMRC's view of the tax treatment by you'd engineer a small transaction to see how they'd react. So a really common example of this used to be that if we wanted to test somebody's domicile status, so if a UK domicile person settles more than £325,000 into trust, there will be an immediate IHT charge on the excess. On the other hand, if a non-dom does the same thing, there's no tax charge. So if you wanted to see if HMRC agreed that you were non-domiciled, you would settle £350,000 into trust, and then you'd tell them that you'd done it. And you'd say, well, no tax is due because I'm a non-dom. And provided you'd made sure you disclosed the facts properly, if HMRC didn't challenge your approach, you could then rely on that as evidence that your view of your domicile status was correct. Now, this was really useful because if HMRC didn't actively disagree with you, it provided a strong basis for how you will be taxed in the future.
Yeah, of course. And unfortunately, that approach doesn't work anymore. And we know this because the courts have made it very clear. And I think, to be fair, in a lot of cases that we have seen, this is actually pretty reasonable, because taxpayers have tried to argue that a position taken by HMRC in 1 year should be binding on them, forever after, even if it's wrong. So the position we find ourselves in today is that if HMRC give you a ruling on something specific, you can rely on that, generally speaking, even if it turns out later that the ruling was wrong. But of course, you can only rely on it for the period that HMRC actually looked at. So in your trust example, if HMRC reviewed the creating of the trust and agreed that you were not domiciled at that point, that binds them for that point in time. But if they look at the position again a year later and decide they got it wrong, they're allowed to change their minds at that point.
And it's also worth bearing in mind that these days, if HMRC don't actively give an opinion on something, you actually can't draw any conclusions from that at all. You especially can't say that because HMRC didn't challenge your treatment, that means the treatment was correct, which means life is much more uncertain than it used to be. Everything is much more up in the air. So where does that leave us? Going back to my poker player, what can I do to work out whether winnings are taxable or not?
Well, I would say the first thing to do is the same as it's always been, isn't it? Which is to go back to the legislation and read what it says there. Because most of the time, this will actually give you the answer. And it's only in some cases, of course, that the rules are so impenetrable that it is genuinely not possible to be sure, how the rules are intended to work. And in cases like that, there is an ability to request what's called a non-statutory clearance from HMRC. Now, I guess this is a relatively new approach, but it is really helpful. However, it is limited because it only covers genuine uncertainties in the law. In the case of your poker player, I think the law is actually perfectly clear. The problem is not the law, it's interpreting the facts to decide which side of the fence you land on. And HMRC just won't help with that, with that analysis. So if you make a non-statutory clearance application for your poker player, HMRC, I think, would just simply refuse to comment because they would say, in this case, there is no uncertainty in the law.
Yeah, I agree. So what that means is there are often cases today where it's just impossible to be sure what the tax position really is. In some cases, we can recommend taking an opinion from tax counsel to provide some comfort, but often even that doesn't help because counsel can say on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and the taxpayer is still left having to make the decision. Ultimately, the best you can do is to make sure that when you're submitting your tax return, you provide an appropriate explanation of the decisions you've made. But in some cases, whatever you do, it's all just going to be a bit of a gamble.
Very true. So on that note, Andrew, have you got a recommendation for us this week?
I do. I'm going to kill two birds with one stone on this. So I'm going to recommend the Ancients podcast, which is a podcast on a channel called History Hit, which have a load of actually really good history-based podcasts. The Ancients, as per its title, covers ancient history and is really worthwhile if you're in any way interested in that sort of subject. It's interviews with specialists, so you get to hear the people who really know what they're talking about. But I'm going to particularly recommend the Ancients podcast on Helen of Troy because the person who's interviewed is Natalie Haynes, who you will, I'm sure, remember, Rachel, I've spoken about before as a recommendation because she's a stand-up comedian, she's a specialist on classics, the Greeks and Romans, and she's altogether fantastic. So a combination of Natalie Haynes, Helen of Troy, ancient history it's sort of my idea of perfection.
Okay, fantastic. I might even give that one a go. Anyway, thank you for listening. Please let us have your comments or your feedback. And remember, we can be contacted on rachel.desouza at rsmuk.com and andrew.robins at rsmuk.com. Bye for now.
Bye.